between the 2 or 3 bones. So joints are present in between the 2 or 3 bones. So joints are classified into mainly 2 types. Write down. Joints are classified into mainly 2 types. Number 1, functional type. Number 1 is a functional type. And number 2, structural type. Number 1 is a functional type. And number 2, structural type. Functional and structural. Functional, which means work, okay? So work of the joint, okay? So which is again classified into 3 types. So according to the function, so classified into 3 types. Number 1, synarthrosis. Number 1, synarthrosis. And number 2, amphiarthrosis. Number 2, amphiarthrosis. And number 3, diarthrosis. Number 3, diarthrosis. So synarthrosis, which means immovable joints. So joint present but it can't move. So that type of joint we called as synarthrosis. Synarthrosis. Okay, they can't move. Next, amphiarthrosis, which means it is a slightly movable joint. Slightly movable joint we called as amphiarthrosis. Slightly movable. Next, diarthrosis, which means free movable joints. Free movable joints. Free movable joint called as diarthrosis. So diarthrosis example is a synovial joints. Example is a synovial joints. So this classification according to the function only. Okay. Next, come to the structural classification. According to the structure, joints are classified into mainly 3 types. Joints are classified into 3 types according to the structure. So joints are classified into 3 types. Number 1, fibrous type. Number 1, fibrous type. Number 2, cartilaginous type. And number 3, synovial type. Okay. So fibrous type, which means there is a presence of the joint. In between the 2 bones, there is a presence of fibrous material. In between the 2 bones, there is a presence of fibrous material. The type of joints we called as fibrous type. Okay, see here. In between the 2 bones, see here is the 1 bone and is another bone. In between these 2 bones, there is a presence of fibrous connective tissue. So this type of joints we called as fibrous type joints. Okay. Then second type is a cartilaginous type. Second type is a cartilaginous type, which means see here present in between the 2 bones there is a in the joint there is a presence of cartilage. So this type we called as cartilaginous type joint. And number 3, third type is nothing but synovial type, which means see here between the 2 bones there is a presence of enveloped by the capsule. That capsule we called as fibrous capsule. Inside of the fibrous capsule, there is a presence of cavity. So that cavity we called as synovial cavity. This synovial cavity is filled with the synovial fluid. So synovial fluid is a thick, transparent, viscous fluid. It is a thick, transparent, viscous fluid called as synovial fluid. Are you getting? Okay. There are mainly three types. So according to the shape, divides into three types: fibrous type, cartilaginous type, and synovial type. So first we discuss the fibrous type. So fibrous type again classifies into three types. Fibrous type again classifies into three types. Number one, sutures. Number one is the sutures. And number two, gomphoses. Number two, gomphoses. And number three, syndesmosis. Syndesmosis. So number one is the suture, means see here. Observe this one. So suture, which means present in the cranium. Okay, cranial bones form in between the two cranial bones. There is a presence of suture. See here, this is a suture. Are you getting? So suture, which means see here, present in between the two bones. There is a presence of fibrous material present in between these two bones, called as suture. Okay. So sutures are again classified into sutures. Multi classified. Sutures are classified into number one, plain suture. Sutures for number one. Plain suture, which means in between the two bones there is the presence of fibrous material. So this type of suture is a plain suture. And come to the number two, serrate suture. Serrate suture, because see here between the two bones there is a presence of zigzag manner. Okay. So here it is filled with the fibrous material. Okay. So this suture we call as serrate suture. Number three, denticulate suture, like a dents, like a teeth-like projections, called as denticulate suture. Next one is a squamous suture. Squamous. So two bones, articular surfaces are flat surfaces. So between the two flat surfaces there is a presence of fibrous material. So this type of suture we called as squamous suture. Okay. Next, syndesmosis. Gomphoses చెప్పుకుంటాం కదా next. Gomphoses. See here, gomphoses, which means is that alveolar socket, means teeth socket. In the teeth socket there is a presence of teeth. So this teeth is communicate with the socket and teeth communicate with the fibrous material. So that's why it is under fibrous type. Okay, under fibrous type, this one is a gomphoses. It also called as peg and socket variety. Peg and socket variety. So there is a alveolar socket and teeth. In between these two there is a presence of fibrous material. So forms a joint called as gomphoses type. Okay. Next type. Next type is a syndesmosis type. Next type is a syndesmosis type. So see here, syndesmosis type, which means between the two bones there is a presence of interosseous membrane. Okay, so this type of joints we called as syndesmosis type. So it is a fibrous material only. Okay, fibrous material, thin sheath formed by the fibrous material, so called as syndesmosis. Syndesmosis. Next, come to the cartilaginous type. So cartilaginous type again classified into two types. Cartilaginous type again classified into two types. See here, the fibrous type completed, right? Then come to the cartilaginous. Divides into two types. Number one is a primary cartilaginous type. Primary cartilaginous type. And number two, secondary cartilaginous type. Number two, secondary cartilaginous type. So number one, primary cartilaginous type, which means, see here, primary cartilaginous type. See here, between the two bones there is the presence of hyaline cartilage plate. So for example, long bone. So long bone, see here, is the epiphysis and this is the diaphysis. So in between the epiphyseal and diaphyseal end there is a presence of cartilage. This cartilage after 21 years it may be ossified, then forms a complete bone. Okay, so this type we called as primary cartilaginous type. Then primary cartilaginous type. Okay, then come to the secondary cartilaginous type. Secondary cartilaginous type. See here, the secondary cartilaginous type, for example, is a pubic symphysis. Example is a pubic symphysis. Between the pubes symphysis, there is the presence of fibrous cartilage and also presence of hyaline cartilage. So this type of joints we called as secondary cartilaginous type. Secondary cartilaginous type joints. Are you getting? Next, come to the synovial type. Number 3. Synovial type. So synovial type, which means there is a presence of the joint. In the joint there is a presence of the cavity. So that cavity we called as synovial cavity. This synovial cavity is filled with the fluid called as synovial fluid. The type of joints we called as synovial type. So synovial type again classified into, number one is a plain type. Plain. Number two, uniaxial. Uniaxial. What is meant by axis? Axis means, suppose we make a one nail, so it produces a movement. What is that movement? Pendulum movement. So whenever we done the one stick, we take the one stick, then we pass the one nail anterior to posteriorly. So that stick which produces the pendulum movement. So that one we called as, that nail we called as axis. So uniaxial, which means there is a presence of the joint. In the joint there is only one axis. Suppose anterior to posterior axis, which produces the pendulum movement. Suppose see here, the shoulder joint. Shoulder joint, whenever we are passing the one nail here, okay, we are passing the one nail here anterior to posteriorly, it produces this pendulum movement, like a pendulum movement. So whenever it runs towards the body side, we call it as adduction. Then away from the body, we call it as abduction. So adduction and abduction, these two movements created by the one axis. So that axis is an anterior-posterior axis. So whenever there is a presence of one joint, there is a presence of only one axis, it produces the two moments. So there is a presence of one axis, it produces the two moments. So some joints there is a presence of two axes, which means it produces the four moments. Some joints there is a presence of three axes, which means that produces the six moments. Okay, suppose see here, there is a in between the two phalanges. In between the two phalanges, there is a one moment is present here, flexion and extension. Are you getting? So this flexion and extension by the transverse axis. Whenever we are passing the transverse axis here, it produces a flexion and extension. Are you getting? Flexion, extension కావాలంటే ఏం చేయాలి? nail ఇట్లా కొట్టాలి. So nail ఇట్లా కొట్టామనుకో ఏమైంది? Adduction, abduction. So by the anterior posterior axis, it produces the adduction and abduction. Whenever you are passing the transverse axis, whenever you produces the transverse axis, it produces the flexion and extension. Are you getting? Yes. Flexion and extension by the transverse axis. Then whenever we are passing the vertical axis, it produces the medial rotation and lateral rotation. Are you getting? So medial and lateral rotation by the vertical axis, adduction and abduction by the anterior posterior axis, then flexion and extension by the transverse axis. So there is a presence of plane joints. Uniaxial means there is a joint present. That joint in the joint there is a passing of only one axis. So that type we called as uniaxial. So uniaxial is nothing but elbow joint. Elbow joint is a uniaxial. See here, we done this movement. Here we doesn't do the adduction and abduction movement. వస్తుందా? కాబట్టి ఇది చేసిన అనుకుంటూ వస్తుంది. So ఇది చేయకుండా చేయాలి. రాదు కదా? Right? So here there is a flexion and extension possible in this elbow joint. So the elbow joint is a uniaxial. Biaxial, which means the two movements. See here, wrist and knee joint. Knee joint produces two movements. Okay, two axis means produces four movements. Okay, flexion, extension. Okay, adduction and abduction. Okay, next saddle. Saddle type. Saddle. So wrist joint. So wrist joint also see here, flexion, extension. Flexion, extension, adduction, abduction. Are you getting? So only one joint, but there is a two axis. Two axis produces a four movements. That we call as biaxial. Next one is a multi-axial, which means there is a presence of one joint. Then there is a through the joint there is a passes of three axes. Suppose shoulder joint. So shoulder joint lo em movement vastundi? See here, adduction, abduction, flexion and extension. Okay, and medial rotation, lateral rotation. Are you getting? So medial and lateral rotation by the vertical axis. Then flexion and extension by the transverse axis. Adduction and abduction by the anterior posterior axis. So only one joint there is a presence of three axes. Three axes means this which produces the six movements. Are you getting? So there is a uniaxial, biaxial and multi-axial. Okay. So first write the plane joints. Plane. So see the example of the plane joint. See here, between the two bones there is the presence of joint. So that joint they can't produce any movement. So intercarpal there is a no movement. So there is a presence of joint. Okay, there is a presence of joint, but there is a no axis. ఎందుకంటే యాక్సిస్ అవసరం లేదు, అది ఎక్కువ తిరగాల్సిన పర్లేదు. జాయింట్ ఉంది అంటే ఉంది అంతే. అట్లాంటి దాన్ని ప్లేన్ జాయింట్ అంటారు. ప్లేన్ జాయింట్ Example, write down the example of the plane joint. Intercarpal joint. Intercarpal joint is a plane joint. See the examples of the plane joint. Write down these examples. Intertarsal joint. Plane lo raskondi. Intertarsal joints. Intermetacarpal joints. Intertarsal joints. అక్కడ వరకు రాయి చాలు. Next, elbow joint. Next, see here. Neck joint is a plane joint completed, right? Next, hinge joint. Hinge joint is under uniaxial. Hinge and pivot type is both are present in the uniaxial type, means which produces the two movements. Okay, number one, first hinge type is a hinge means like a, see here. See here is a hinge. Okay. Okay. Present in between the humerus and ulna. Humero-ulnar joint. Humero-ulnar joint is a hinge type. Example. Humero-ulnar. Humero-ulnar is an example. Example of the hinge. Next, pivot type example. Pivot. So pivot example, see here. Pivot joint present. Pivot joint is example is a C1 and C2. Atlas and axis. So atlanto-axial joint. Right on. Atlanto-axial joint. So joint present in between the C1 and C2 called as atlanto-axial joint, which produces the no movement. No analytic no. So this no movement is possible with the atlanto-axial. Okay. So don't do the no movement and then we joint use here. Okay. No అన్నాం అనుకోండి ఎక్కడ మూవ్ అవుతుంది 1 and 2 C1 and C2 produces the no movement. So no movement by the which axis? Vertical axis. So hinge is the transverse axis. Hinge by the transverse axis, pivot by the vertical axis. Next type is a condylar type. See here, condylar. Okay. So biaxial, ellipsoid, and condylar. First we discuss the ellipsoid type. Ellipsoid. See the ellipsoid type. See here is a convexity and here concavity. So which produces the metacarpophalangeal joint. Example is a metacarpophalangeal. Metacarpal ki phalanges ki మధ్యలో జాయింట్స్ ఏవైతే ఉన్నాయో వాటిని ఏమనాలి ellipsoid joints. So this ellipsoid joints produces the one or two movements. ఎన్ని ఉన్నాయి biaxial గా ఇది by under two movements create the two movements. Flexion and extension, adduction and abduction, like this. Flexion, extension, adduction, abduction. Are you getting? So flexion, extension, adduction and abduction. Two axis passes here. That's why it produces the four movements. Okay. Next one is a condylar type. Condylar type. Example is a temporomandibular joint. Temporomandibular joint. means lower jaw movement. So lower jaw movement, one is transverse axis, produces the flexion and extension, and anterior to posterior axis. Are you getting? Gliding movement. Gliding movement by the anterior posterior axis, then flexion and extension by the transverse axis. So two axes passes here. So that's why it is a temporomandibular joint is a condylar type. So it is a biaxial type. Okay. Come to the next one. Saddle type. Saddle type. Saddle type example is a carpo-metacarpal joints. Carpo-metacarpal. Carpo-metacarpal. That is the first carpo-metacarpal and first carpo-metacarpal joint. It is like a saddle, like this. So convexo concave. Convexo concave. See here, convexity, concave. Here concavity, convexity. So this type we called as first carpo-metacarpal. It is a biaxial. Then come to the multi-axial. Come to the multi-axial. Multi-axial is a shoulder joint and hip joint. Multi-axial, shoulder joint and hip joint. So they produces the 6 movements. Okay, produces the 6 movements. So what are the movements? 6 movements and the children. Flexion, extension, adduction, abduction, medial rotation, lateral rotation, and circumflexion. So possible in the shoulder and hip joint. So that's why it is a ball and socket type. Ball and socket variety. Okay. So this joint we called as multi-axial joint. So through this joint there is a 3 axis passes through this joint, then what produces the 6 movements. Okay, are you getting? Once you check this picture, see here, whenever we are passing the anterior-posterior axis, okay, anterior-posterior axis pass student adduction and abduction movement of adduction and abduction. Whenever we are passing the T means transverse axis. Whenever we are passing the transverse axis, it produces a flexion and extension. Are you getting? So whenever we are passing the vertical axis, V means vertical axis. So produces a medial rotation and lateral rotation. Are you getting? So this is the classification of the joints. Okay. So joints classification is a 10 marks. So you must be draw the all diagram. Okay, all diagrams. See here, fibrous type, cartilaginous type, and synovial type. First diagram. Okay. Next diagram, suture. Sutures types. Next, syndesmosis, gymphosis. Next, primary cartilaginous joints. Secondary cartilaginous joints, synovial type, plain joint, hinge joint. Then this one is a atlantoaxial joint, pivot, condylar joint, Next, ellipsoid joint, saddle type. Then ball and socket type. Then axis. Are you getting? So this one is for the 10 marks. So you must be write the all classification. So LSD classification of the joints. Let's question 10 marks. So you must be classify the all those things like this. So functional type, cartilage functional type and structural type. So functional type there is a three classification. So classified into three immovables like